What's going on, everyone? It's Ben from YGO from Zero, back with another retro Yu-Gi-Oh format video, and this is going to be a long one because this is my preliminary guide to MRL format. Now, the reason it's preliminary is because this format has been a lot more complicated and interesting than any of us thought going into it. And I really do think that there are a lot of undiscovered strategies and a lot of optimization to be done in the format to really figure out what the best cards are, what people should play, what people shouldn't play, and what sort of decks. And I think it's a very exciting format for that reason. But before we can get into what makes this format so complex and what all the different choices are in it, we need to first discuss all the cards in this set and discuss what new strategies, what new paths they have for the metagame as a whole. It's going to be a long one, folks, because this is not a small set, and it introduced a lot of very interesting cards. So we're going to be in this for a while, but hopefully by the end of it, you have a good grasp on what this format is, what the best strategies are, what some of the less good strategies that still have some merit are, and also why it is actually a lot more fun than you might expect. But before we dive into this guide, if you enjoy this sort of content covering these old retro Yu-Gi-Oh formats very exhaustively, then I've got a lot more videos like it on my channel that you might want to check out. And I will be producing a lot more videos in the future that you might want to also check out. So if you're not already subscribed, be sure to subscribe. And also, if you watch this guide and are interested in actually playing this format for yourself, we actually have a Discord server now where you can play this format with a lot of other cool people. It's been where I've been testing out this format pretty extensively, and people have had some really awesome ideas, done some really awesome theory crafting and testing with this format, and it's just made this a blast. So if you're interested in playing this for yourself, please be sure to join it. Link will be in the description down below. And of course, as always, if you enjoy this video, please be sure to give it a like. But with that out of the way, let's dive into this format. Now, before getting into the majority of the strategies and cards in this format, there are a couple cards that I've got to discuss first, as they are pretty format defining and what a lot of people would term toxic. And these are the three hand rip cards. So they're Confiscation, Delinquent Duo, and the Forceful Sentry. Now, these three cards all have an effect that basically decimates your opponent's hand in some way. Confiscation allows you to pay 1,000 life points, look at your opponent's hand, and then select one card in it and discard that card. Delinquent Duo is very similar. You pay the 1,000 life points just like with Confiscation, but you don't get to look at your opponent's hand. Instead, you discard one random card from their hand, and then they choose another card to discard. So in this case, you don't get the hand knowledge, but you are discarding more cards from your opponent's hand. Lastly, the Forceful Sentry says look at your opponent's hand, select one card among them, and return it to his or her deck. The deck is then shuffled. So Forceful Sentry, you get the hand knowledge that Confiscation provides, but you don't have to pay a cost, and that card does go back to the deck and can potentially be used later. Now, there's a lot of debate over actually which of these cards you want to use, because in MRL format, we're actually not playing with the limited list that takes Magic Ruler into account. We're actually just playing with the limited list from Critter format. So none of the new cards that I'm going to be talking about are actually going to be on that list. So you can play any of the new cards at 3 copies, which means that you could realistically have 9 hand rip cards in your deck, which is very, very insane. Like, that almost guarantees that you're going to have a hand rip card in the opening hand. So if you go first, you can just decimate your opponent's hand completely without them really being able to do anything about it. However, in testing out this format a bit and in theory crafting this format, we've realized that in general, you don't want to play all 9 of these cards. While it can be very good going first and just decimating your opponent's hand, over the course of the game, especially as it gets later in the game, drawing these hand rip cards can be a bit of a brick, as your opponent will likely have less cards in hand because they'll have either played them or they will have gotten hand ripped before. So they become a bit dead later on in the game, which can be really devastating if your opponent's able to get back momentum and just take you down because you're just drawing dead hand rip cards. So honestly, most decks aren't playing 3 copies of all of these, and most decks aren't even playing all 3 in general. They're just choosing 2 of them and potentially maxing out on all of those. And there are some decks that don't even play the hand rips at all just because of deck space. So there's a lot of interesting theory that goes into these hand rip cards, and it's not as simple as you might initially think given their power level. Now, of course, there is another spell that was released in the set that's very strong that can take advantage of playing all 9 hand rip cards in a deck, and that's Painful Choice. Now, Painful Choice is a very interesting card in this format, as a lot of people, myself included, have come to the opinion that it's actually not the best in most decks, but it can be very good in very specific decks. So Painful Choice is a card that says select 5 cards from your deck, show them to your opponent. Your opponent selects 1 card among them, you add that card to your hand, and send the remaining cards to the graveyard. Now, this can be very good in a sort of combo deck to ensure that you get a specific combo piece that you need. It can also be good at doing some graveyard setup if you're playing things like Magician of Faith that can get you back cards from the graveyard. And maybe most importantly, in the case of the hand rips, if you're playing all 9 hand rips, you can send 5 hand rips to the graveyard with this. Your opponent gives you 1, and you automatically have another hand rip in hand, potentially turn 1. However, this could come back to bite you a little bit. If you send, for instance, all your copies of Delinquent Duo, your opponent never has to play around it for the rest of the game. And similarly, if you send a bunch of hand rips, your opponent will likely know that they don't really have to be as afraid of the hand rips as they otherwise would be. In addition, if you don't draw the Painful Choices early and you're planning to do this with a 9 hand rip deck, then it can just be a brick later in the game. You could draw the cards that you wanted to send off Painful Choice to early, and by the time you draw Painful Choice, there's no real good sends in your deck. Of course, this card does have other uses outside of just graveyard setup or early first turn hand rip plays. It can also be used when you're just trying to close out the game, but you need one of like a select few cards. You can Painful Choice to potentially get that 1 card to hand and enable you to just win out of nowhere potentially. So this can be a very good closer. But in this format, I think it's just a little bit too situational in most cases to actually see generic use. But it is a very powerful card in the right circumstances, so that's why I want to sort of discuss it in this section where I'm discussing the most powerful generic cards that come out in this set, specifically for this format. It's a card that, you should be aware of and you should potentially have on your radar if you're deck building a particular type of deck. Speaking of building a particular type of deck, this set also introduced a very interesting card in Upstart Goblin. Now, this is a basically free card, and what I mean by that is it just replaces itself. So, when you play this card, you draw 1 card, and then your opponent gains 1,000 life points. So, basically, if you play 3 Upstart Goblins in a 40-card deck, you're basically playing a 37-card deck, as each of these cards will just replace itself at the low cost of increasing your opponent's life points by 1,000. So I think that this definitely can see play in these decks, as deck thinning is always useful. However, it hasn't seen play in a lot of decks that have come out of testing this format, and that's because there are so many powerful cards that you don't really need to deck thin in this format. Your deck will basically be all gas anyways, in most cases. There are certain decks that I think can take good advantage of this, and some that can actually manipulate Upstart Goblin's 1,000 life point gain to their own advantages, which I'll talk about later. But I think overall, most decks don't play this card in this format. I think this is maybe one of those cards that people should look into more, and is maybe one of the most underexplored techs in this format. But as is, most people aren't playing this. It is a very generic card that can potentially increase the power level and consistency of a variety of decks. So that's why I wanted to discuss it here. But overall, you probably won't see this played too much, at least in the meta how it stands. And this is what I mean by this being a very preliminary guide. We've done a lot of testing of this format, but we've only been testing for like a couple weeks at most. And you can't really truly get to the ins and outs of an entire format like this in a couple weeks. There's some formats where a tier 0 deck becomes very clear very early on, and there's no real way to sort of get around that fact. In this format, I hesitate to call it tier 0. I know some people do call it tier 0, but I feel like the deck that a lot of people call tier 0 in this format is kind of more nebulous than they give it credit for, so I really hesitate to call this a tier 0 format. I'll get into that later though when we actually discuss the decks themselves. Another major change that this format makes over Critter format is making spell and trap removal a lot more accessible. In Critter format, you only really had Heavy Storm, and that was limited to 2 copies. In MRL format, you actually have a lot more options, as MRL format released both Giant Trunade and Mystical Space Typhoon. Now, Giant Trunade is very similar to Heavy Storm in a way. It says, return all spell and trap cards on the field to the hand. Now, this has a little bit of caveats, as your opponent can potentially chain a trap like Waboku to it, and in that case, the Waboku will actually go to grave instead of returning to hand. But either way, this can be used to clear the way to make an aggressive push. It can also be used in certain mill decks that are trying to get big card destruction plays off, but we'll get into that later when we cover the different deck types. Giant Trunade, though, is a very powerful card in this format and in formats going forward, and unlike some of the other power spells on this list, it will actually remain at 3 copies for quite some time. So it's a good card to keep in mind both now and also later as we continue our journey forward. However, arguably even more powerful is Mystical Space Typhoon. Now, this is a quick play spell, which is actually a new type of spell card introduced in this set that says target 1 spell and trap card on the field, destroy that target. Now, just reading this, you might think that this is actually a lot weaker than something like Trunade or Heavy Storm, but I actually think it may be stronger than both of them. And the reason for this is that it's a quick play spell. Now, quick play spells are a new type of spell introduced into this set that can actually be used during your opponent's turn. So for instance, if your opponent sets a trap card on their turn, at the end of that turn you can actually flip up Mystical Space Typhoon and destroy whatever they set before they get a chance to use it, which can be very powerful. In addition, at this time in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, quick play spells could actually be used the turn that they're set, which can lead to some pretty devastating situations. If your opponent has a Mystical Space Typhoon of their own set along with another back row, and you set a Mystical Space Typhoon, and your opponent tries to get rid of it by activating Mystical Space Typhoon of their own, then you can actually flip up your Mystical Space Typhoon and chain it, and take out the remaining back row, which can be incredibly strong, and is something that you have to consider when making an end of turn Mystical Space Typhoon push. But this card is incredibly devastating and sees a ton of play in this format for good reason, so it's something that you have to be aware of. It can also deal with the next card on this list, which is Snatch Steal, which is also an insane card in this format. Snatch Steal is an equip spell that you equip to a monster your opponent controls, and you take control of that monster. And then during each of your opponent's standby phases, they gain 1,000 life points. Now, the life point gain can get out of hand, like if your opponent does have a card that can stall you for a bit, and you can't really get in damage with their monster, then they can go up a fair amount of life points. But in the balance, this card will deal a lot more damage than your opponent's going to gain from it. This card is basically Change of Heart, except it can't target like flip monsters, so it's not quite as powerful as Change of Heart is in my opinion. But it can still make for some incredibly strong aggressive pushes. If you Snatch Steal your opponent's one face-up monster and just get in for a ton of damage, that can be very powerful. It does die to Mystical Space Typhoon, as I just mentioned, which can be a bit of a risk with it. But in decks that are trying to go aggressive, I think it's a very good tool. Now, of course, it does suffer against some of the more stally decks in the format that are playing a lot of set monsters. But it can even have uses in those matchups as well, as it can steal an opponent's monster once it's flipped up and still potentially get in some damage. So all in all, I think this is a very good card that should see play in a lot of more aggressive strategies. But while Magic Ruler introduced some incredibly powerful spell cards, it also introduced some important monsters. Maybe not on the same level of power as the spells, but some good ones to mention nonetheless. So the most important of the monsters, in my opinion, is Cyberjar. Now, Cyberjar is a very interesting card, as a lot of people have very different opinions on it. Some people actually think it's not even worth playing in the main deck, as its effect can be very swinging and can potentially benefit your opponent more than it can you. But it's still a card that sees a lot of play and is a very important card to know about if you're attacking into a set monster. So Cyberjar is a flip monster that's effect reads, when it's flipped face up, destroy all monsters on the field, then both players reveal the top 5 cards from their deck. They special summon all revealed level 4 or lower monsters in face-up attack or face-down defense position. Also, they add any remaining cards to their hand. And if they have less than 5 cards in the deck, then they just do as many as possible. So this card isn't like card destruction. It can't necessarily deck your opponent out just through its effect. That being said, its effect still is incredibly strong, and that case doesn't really come up that often. This card can basically serve as a dark hole on your opponent's turn, just clearing away the entire board in a case where they've got a lot of aggressive pressure on field and you don't really have any way to protect yourself. Now, this can just replenish their aggressive board and deprive you of any defensive measures if your opponent hits a lot of monsters. It can also, if it's activated on your opponent's turn, give them a bunch of hand rip cards, as hand rip cards are basically the name of the game in this format, and they can just decimate your hand after you sort of replenish it. But all that being said, I think this card is still very powerful and is good as just a last case option in cases where you're just backs to the wall and you need to have something to deal with your opponent's big offensive threats here. So I do personally play it in a lot of my decks, but it's definitely a card that you don't have to play, which makes it very interesting, as going into this format, you know, I think myself and a lot of other people thought that it would be an instant include in pretty much any deck. Now, as the format's been tested a lot more, that's proven definitely not to be the case. Still a very important card to keep in mind, though, if you're deck building and if you're attacking into opponent's sets. The next monster I want to talk about is actually very situational precisely to this MRL format, and that's Electric Snake. Now, Electric Snake is a card that a lot of people found very underwhelming. I myself personally find it very underwhelming as well. I personally wouldn't include it in many decks, but I do think it's very important to talk about here, as it can be incredibly powerful if its effect does go off. So Electric Snake says, when this card is discarded from your hand to the graveyard by the effect of a card controlled by your opponent, draw 2 cards from your deck. And the reason why this can be powerful is because it can play around Delinquent Duo. So oftentimes if your opponent draws a Delinquent Duo turn 1 and they just activate it blindly, you can get a lot of value if you've drawn the Electric Snake in your opening hand, discarding the Electric Snake to draw 2, and basically make the Delinquent Duo useless. You can also search Electric Snake with something like Sangan or Witch late game to sort of serve as a buffer against your opponent's Delinquent Duos, preventing them from activating any more. Either way, this card basically nullifies one of the most powerful hand rips in the format, and a hand rip that a lot of decks are playing. So it's a good card to consider in that regard. However, if you want to increase your consistency of actually drawing this in the opening hand, you likely need to play 3 copies. And as I said before, the decks in this format are filled with all these super powerful cards. And so playing Electric Snake kind of feels like a real step down. You could just be playing better cards. But I don't know, some people do like this card in this format, and it does see play in a variety of decks. And it's definitely a card that you've got to keep in mind. If you open with a Delinquent Duo and a Forceful Sentry, you might want to activate the Forceful Sentry first, just to play around Electric Snake a little bit. But it's a very niche card, and it only really sees play in this format, I think. As going forward, there just aren't really enough cards that make Electric Snake worth playing in the deck. But it is certainly a card to consider in this format. And lastly, for these sort of generic cards, I want to mention Mystic Tomato. Now, Mystic Tomato is part of a set of new recruiters that this set introduces, and the other recruiters are very similar to Mystic Tomato. They all have the effect that when they're destroyed by battle and sent to the graveyard, you can special summon 1 monster of their respective attribute with 1500 or less attack from your deck in face-up attack position. But the reason I'm covering Mystic Tomato here is it's the one that actually has a lot of good targets to go into. Note that both Sangan and Witch of the Black Forest are dark, so you can go into either of them very easily. You can also go into a powerful card like Cannon Soldier to potentially end out the game. You can even go into something like Masked Sorcerer, although Masked Sorcerer does, I think, see a bit less play in this format than it did in Critter. You can go into that card and potentially get a draw off your opponent. So there's a veritable toolbox of cards that you can get with Mystic Tomato, and even some new cards as well. For instance, there's a card Giant Germ in this set, which I'll talk about soon, that could also be a good Mystic Tomato target. But this is a card that sees a lot of play in just some generic decks, because there's just so many good generic targets to go into. So while you could make a Dark Tribal deck with it, its usage lies more as a generic recruiter than a Dark Tribal Enabler. But that's going to do it for the new cards that I think are generic. Before moving on to some of the other cards in this set, I want to discuss both the cards from the previous formats that are still very, very useful in this format, and also the limited list that this format has, as that is a very important ground rule to get out of the way before we dive into some of the more jank strategies. So firstly, from the past cards that are still useful here, we've of course got Cannon Soldier. It's still a very powerful way to close out some games, and it's even gotten a bit better in things like burn strategies. They can really take use of Cannon Soldier to be really devastating for the opponent. We of course also have Magician of Faith. There are so many more powerful spells in this format that got introduced that you can get back with this card. This card has just become incredibly, incredibly strong. In addition, you can also do some graveyard setup with Painful Choice, but that feels kind of underwhelming to me, and I wouldn't really bank on that as a really good strategy. It is something that you can do, however, so important thing to keep in mind. Maneater Bug has actually seen a resurgence in this format, as a lot of the games get down to very simplified game states due to the hand rip cards. So if both players are hand ripping their opponent, then they'll likely wind up with a lot less resources than they would have otherwise, which makes Maneater Bug a lot more powerful, as it's 1-for-1 removal that also serves as sort of a blocker to protect your life points in a worst case scenario. And even if he does hit a recruiter, which is unfortunate, you can often then just use a hand rip card to take away whatever your opponent adds to hand. So I think Maneater Bug is a pretty good card in this format that has seen a lot of resurgence here. It's also emerged as sort of an option for players who don't want to play a Cyberjar in the main deck, as it serves a similar purpose to Cyberjar, dismantling your opponent's aggressive boards, but also it doesn't sort of have the risk that Cyberjar has associated with it. So, very good card in this format. Mass Sorcerer, as I mentioned, is kind of decent. You can search it off a Mystic Tomato. I don't necessarily think it's as good as it was in Critter, but it is still a card that can see some use in this format, so I thought I'd mention it here. The Recruiters, Sangan, and Witch are still very, very good, so they see play in pretty much any deck in this format. Still incredibly powerful, so definitely cards to consider. I want to mention Thunder Dragon here, as it can sort of serve as a bit of a buffer to the hand rip cards. I don't necessarily think it's that good, though, in this format, as two of the hand rip cards are very targeted in the form of Forceful Sentry and Confiscation. And so I think the power of this card has really fallen a lot from in Critter. And as I said with Upstart Goblin, you don't really need to deck thin in this format, as you just got so many powerful cards you can play instead. However, this card does play well with Magic Jammer, which I think has improved a little bit in this format, as I'll discuss later when I cover it. To finish off the monsters, though, the level 4 or lower monsters with the highest attack and defense respectively without any sort of negative downsides are Giant Soldier of Stone, which has 2,000 defense, and Mechanical Chaser, which has 1,850 attack. These are cards that will see generic play in a lot of different decks, as just having this sort of max stat can be very useful. I will say I have seen the usage of 2K defenders like Giant Soldier of Stone sort of decrease a little bit from Critter format. I think there are just more ways to deal with them, especially if you're playing 3 Snatch Deals in the deck. But I still think it's an important card to keep in mind for the defensive aspect. Moving on to the spells that are still very useful. Of course, the Power 5 limited spells are of course great. I'll discuss them when I discuss the limited list that's still in effect. But a spell that is sort of less on their power level that I think is still very strong is Fissure. Just being able to clear away one of your opponent's monsters, as I said, on simplified game state can be very, very good. And so I think this card still has its place in a lot of decks. So definitely a card to keep in mind and consider. Moving on to the traps, Magic Jammer I think has gotten a lot more strong in this format, as if your opponent activates something like a Delinquent Duo, you can use Magic Jammer. You're still discarding a card, but you get to choose what card you discard, and you're not losing 2 cards, you're just losing 1. Now, some would argue that this isn't really a worthwhile exchange here, but it still can be useful at combating the threat of hand rips, just making it so that at least your opponent doesn't get hand knowledge or potentially more discards than they otherwise would. In addition, given how many powerful new spell cards are in this format, this could just be a consideration given the higher density of powerful spells, just being able to negate any of them when you need to. And monsters like Thunder Dragon could be used to enhance this card as well. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. I think if you're playing this card, you probably shouldn't play the Thunder Dragons, but it's a good thing to keep in mind. The other counter traps also still have their uses. I think 7 tools, though, is a lot worse in this format, as there are just a lot less good traps that people are playing. So I think, honestly, you should probably cut out 7 tools from your decks, as it won't likely get any value. But it is a good card to keep in mind that is in the format. So maybe you might want to play it in the side deck if you're playing against a more control strategy, playing a bunch of counter traps. I don't think it's really worth playing, though. A counter trap that's potentially more worth playing, though, is Solemn Judgment. Solemn Judgment can be very, very strong in this format, just like in Critter, although it is a bit riskier in my opinion, as this format is a lot more explosive. There are a lot more ways to die out of nowhere, so maybe this is more of a side deck card than a main deck card now. But it is an important card to keep in mind, and a very powerful card in the right circumstances. Moving on to the other traps, Trap Hole can still see play in this format. I think it's a lot less good given the large amount of spell and trap removal now in the format, but it does have its uses, so I could definitely see playing it in the main or side deck. But the trap card that sees by far the most play in this format, besides Mirror Force, which I'll cover when we see the limited list, is Waboku. Now, Waboku is very, very powerful as a defensive option, which this format can be very explosive with things like Cyberjar and the like. So I think it's a very good option to have. But more importantly, it can be chained to things like Giant Trunade or Heavy Storm, or even Mystical Space Typhoon if this isn't the first turn you set it. I think that property alone propels this card into a main deck 3 of in pretty much every deck. I think some people might disagree with me there, just because if you can sort of play more powerful spells instead, you might not even need a defensive option like this. You might just be able to win through damage alone and not be forced to use Waboku. But I still think it's very, very good, and it can be used in a worst case scenario where your opponent's trying to make a huge aggressive push with the various spell and trap removal cards in this set. So I like this card at 3 copies, and I think it's still a format staple. Now that I've discussed some of the more powerful past format cards, let's go ahead and discuss the limited list. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time going over this limited list, as it is the same one in Critter format. So, if you've seen my coverage of that, then nothing has really changed here. But it is important to note for people who haven't seen this. So, all 5 Exodia pieces are limited. Exodia is basically a non-threat in this format due to all the hand rips, so this doesn't really matter right now. But this was very important for some previous formats. The Power 5 limited spells, Change of Heart, Dark Hole, Monster Reborn, Pot of Greed, Raigeki, are all insanely strong and see play in pretty much every deck. So these are very, very good cards to know about. Their power level has not decreased. They're still very, very good. The one limited trap, Mirror Force, is similarly very strong. Even though spell and trap removal has increased in this format, I think that Mirror Force is still worth playing in most decks, as it can stem a very aggressive push. And with Cyberjar in the format, like I said, it's good to have this sort of insurance in case your opponent does make that sort of aggressive push. Of course, the 2 recruiters, Sangan and Witch, are semi-limited and are very strong. These see play pretty much at 4 copies in every deck. We have 2 card destruction, which is actually very important given that Mill sees a bit of a resurgence in this format, which I'll get to when I cover the decks. But this card is very good that it's semi-limited, as at 3 copies, it might be a bit too much. We also have 2 Heavy Storm on here. This is a very powerful spell that should see play in pretty much every deck, even though there are a lot of other spell and trap removal options. So I guess you don't have to play this in every deck, it's just a very good card to know about and play around. Lastly, we have 2 Swords Revealing Light, which actually see a major downgrade this format. With the introduction of so much more spell and trap removal, like Mystical Space Typhoon and Giant Trunade, this card becomes a lot worse. Now, it's not to say it's unplayable, it still very much is, and does see play in a fair amount of decks, but in a more aggressive deck, I think this is definitely a card you can cut, as it's just not as useful to you as your other spells, and it is likely to get less value than it would in previous formats. But I'm not going to spend too much more time here. I just wanted to briefly mention this limited list for people who didn't know what it was. Now that we've covered this, let's cover some more interesting cards that I think definitely could see play, but are a bit iffier than the other cards that I've covered. Now, I call this section Cards to Consider because these are some very interesting cards that, aren't terrible, but they're not necessarily the best either, and whether you use them or not, I think really depends on what deck you're playing. So, firstly, I want to start out with Banisher of the Light. Now, this is a crazy anti-meta card. It says any card that's sent to the graveyard is banished instead. And there are a lot of cards in this format that really do rely on sending things to the graveyard. For instance, Sandganon Witch won't trigger if they aren't sent to the graveyard. Same with any of the recruiters like Mystic Tomato. So this can be an incredibly powerful anti-meta card, and it even has a bit of a lockdown combo with the continuous spell Gravekeeper's Servant, which is also a new card in this set, but I don't really think is worth discussing in this section, as it's generally used for mill decks potentially, and it doesn't really have much general use outside of the Banisher Gravekeeper's Servant lock. The lock is basically this. Gravekeeper's Servant says that unless your opponent sends one card from the top of their deck to the graveyard, they cannot declare an attack. And when Banisher of the Light is on field, they can't actually send the top card of their deck to the graveyard because it would be banished instead. So when you have Banisher of the Light and Gravekeeper's Servant on field, your opponent actually can't attack, which is a pretty neat combo. I'm not really sure how necessary it is, as you know, if Banisher of the Light's in defense mode, there aren't many things that can get over it anyways by attacking. But I guess if Banisher of the Light is face up on the field and you activate Gravekeeper's Servant, then that does protect it for the turn. And, you know, you could have some other monsters that you want to protect besides Banisher, so I guess there's that. But, you know, I think the main use of Banisher is more as an anti-meta tech, just to play in decks that don't really care about sending their own cards to the graveyard, and just to really mess up decks that do. So, a very interesting card. Not sure if it will see play in the future, but maybe something to experiment with. Moving on, we actually have two very similar cards, and those are Giant Germ and Nimble Mamanga. Now, the reason why I'm lumping these together is because they both have a very similar effect. They both have 1,000 attack and 100 defense, and when they're destroyed, they get to fetch out 2 more copies from the deck, and either inflict damage to your opponent or increase your own life points. So Nimble Mamanga says that when it's destroyed by battle, it's sent to the graveyard, you gain 1,000 life points, and you can special summon any number of Nimble Mamanga from your deck in face down defense position. Giant Germ, on the other hand, says when it's destroyed by battle and sent to the graveyard, you get to inflict 500 damage to your opponent and special summon any number of Giant Germs from your deck in face up attack position. Now, these aren't cards that we'll see play in every deck, but it can actually enhance certain decks. For instance, if you've got a deck that wants to play tribute monsters, these fetch out multiple monsters on field to serve as tribute materials. And if you've got a burn deck that's maybe playing Cannon Soldier as well, you can use Giant Germ to inflict 500 damage by battle, and then fetch out 2 more monsters that can be tributed off for a Cannon Soldier. Same with Nimble Mamanga, honestly, as the burn decks that we're going to cover actually do have some self-burn components as well. So Nimble Mamanga can be very useful in that setting. Nimble Mamanga, of course, can be a very useful anti-burn measure as well, so it might be something that you want to have in the side deck in case you face a burn deck. What makes these cards additionally powerful is that they can be fetched out by attributable recruiters. Mystic Tomato, of course, can fetch out Giant Germ, and Mystic Tomato is played in a variety of decks, so it could be good to also include 3 copies of Giant Germ in your deck to easily go into off of a Tomato. But Nimble Mamanga has to be fetched by Giant Rat, which I don't think is that bad of a combo, especially given that Giant Rat can fetch out some very interesting other cards as well. So it can also sort of serve as a toolbox, kind of like Mystic Tomato did. Now, its toolbox is a bit less good, but it's still decent. You know, it's not terrible. For instance, Muka Muka can be fetched off of Giant Rat. And while Muka Muka has gotten a lot less good in this format, given both the presence of Mechanical Chaser and the presence of the hand rip cards that can really deplete your hand and make Muka very, very weak, it can still be a decent fetch off of Giant Rat if you've got enough cards in hand to actually support it. In addition, if you want to get a bit more defensive, Giant Rat can fetch out the monster with the highest defense in this format, which is Labyrinth Wall. Now, Labyrinth Wall is a level 5 tribute monster, so, you know, you might not want to play it in the deck as it can brick if you draw it. But if your opponent doesn't have any more attackers after they attack into Giant Rat, you can bring out a Labyrinth Wall, next turn switch it to defense, and you've got a 3k defender on your side of the field, which can be very tough for your opponent to get over. The last monster I want to mention in regard to Giant Rat is Karate Man. So Karate Man isn't the best card. You know, it's Actually pretty bad in my opinion, but it can be a decent fetch off of Giant Rat. So just like with Labyrinth Wall, you'd want to bring this out last when your opponent doesn't have any more attacks left. And if you bring a Karate Man during your next turn, you can double the original attack of this card. So that way you've got a 2000 attack monster that can attack into your opponent's stuff, which can be pretty decent. So these are all cards to consider playing with Giant Rat. And, you know, you could reasonably make a deck like that, so that's why I'm including it here. I think it's much less powerful than Mystic Tomato, but it does have a bit of a toolbox of its own that it can go into. Another attributable recruiter that has a little bit of a toolbox it can go into is Shining Angel. Now, Shining Angel is basically the recruiter for light monsters, and there are a couple light monsters that are worth going into. White Magical Hat is potentially a great pick off of Shining Angel, being able to discard your opponent's hand down even more. Now, you might argue that it's a lot less impactful in this format when you've got the hand rip cards already, but it can still be decent, and just having a monster that can continuously hand rip is very worthwhile. In addition, if you want to get a bit more defensive, you can bring out something like the Unhappy Maiden, which ends the battle phase once it's destroyed by battle. Now, it does have 0 attack, so if you are using it for this purpose and not like a Labyrinth Wall purpose where you switch to defense next turn, then you can still take a fair amount of damage from this, but it is a way to end the battle phase in a worst case scenario. In addition, if you want to go a bit more defensive, you can bring out something like Ceremonial Bell, which is a monster with 1850 defense that also has an additional effect that both players must keep their hands revealed. Now, this isn't the best defender that light monsters have to offer. Something like Mystical Elf or Spirit of the Harp is probably a bit better, as it does have 2000 defense and more than 0 attack. And also, playing with your hand revealed can be a bit of a downside. But if you want that hand knowledge and you don't really care about giving up your own hand knowledge, then this card can be pretty good. Shining Angel can also be used to bring out Banisher of the Light if you want a bit more of a defensive option. That also is very anti-meta. Although playing Banisher of the Light in a deck that is using recruiters like Shining Angel can be a bit of an anti-synergy. So that's something to watch out for. In addition to these targets, there are 2 more I want to talk about. Gods with the Third Eye is a light card, and so if you're playing a Fusion Substitute deck, then you definitely could fetch this out with Shining Angel to make your Fusion plays go a bit more easily. However, I think the Fusion Substitute deck is a lot less good in this format than it was in TP1 format, because it's just, there's so many hand rips that can take away your fusion materials and potentially take away your polymerizations as well. So it's a lot less consistent, and so I don't really think it's that good, but you could play Shining Angel to attempt to increase the consistency a little bit. I guess you could also play things like Mystic Tomato with Versago the Destroyer, or Mother Grizzly, which I'll cover soon, with Beast King of the Swamps to get the same effect. But we're talking about Shining Angel here, so we'll talk about Gods with the Third Eye. The last light monster that you might want to bring out with this card is something like Time Wizard, which can just be a very powerful card to clear away your opponent's board in a worst case scenario. Now, of course, it's a coin flip, so you might not get it right. But, you know, being able to fetch out Raigeki from the deck is pretty good, and if the coin toss goes off, that's what this card is. The last monster to potentially consider is a card that's extremely, extremely powerful in certain decks, and is actually a staple of those decks, and it's Spear Cretin. Now, Spear Cretin is a very interesting flip monster. When this card is sent to the graveyard after being flipped, each player selects 1 monster from their graveyard and special summons it in either face-up attack or face-down defense position. So, when you have a Spear Cretin on field and a Spear Cretin in graveyard, you can actually set up a loop where you just bring back the other Spear Cretin, and your opponent can't really get through it unless they clear it when the Spear Cretin is set. So it can be used just to infinitely stall your opponent. It can also be used to bring back powerful flip monsters like Magician of Faith or Cyberjar, so it can be very good in that regard as well. However, it can be a bit of a double-edged sword. If your opponent has powerful flip monsters in Grave or things like Cannon Soldier that can easily clear away an entire field, then this card can actually turn into a major detriment to you instead of a benefit. But in decks that are more stall-based, this card can be a superstar. So, very good card to consider if you're building that sort of deck, and a very good card to be aware of in this format, as it does see play in a fair amount of decks. Moving on to the spells, you know, this set introduced a variety of very powerful equip spells, so much so that you could honestly form your own deck around it, which I will discuss soon, but you could also just use them generically. right? Like Acts of Despair is a 1,000 attack point boost that can be very strong, just equipping it to a monster and attacking over one of your opponents. Very, very good. Malevolent Nuzzler is a 700 boost, which if you want to play more than just the Axes of Despairs and get that guaranteed attack increase, then this is probably the way to go. There is another 700 attack boosting equip spell in this format, but I'll discuss that when I discuss the other equip spells, as it does have some detriments that Malevolent Nuzzler might not. The last equip spell that you might want to see general use for is Megamorph. Now, Megamorph is a very interesting card. When your life points are lower than your opponent's, it doubles the attack of the monster you equip it to. But when your life points are higher than your opponent's, it actually halves the attack of the monster you equip it to. So this actually can be very versatile, as you can equip it to your own monsters when you're behind to just have a huge attacker on field, or you could equip it to your opponent's monsters when you're ahead to cut them down by half. Now, this can be a bit risky, as if you equip it to one of your own monsters, then your opponent could potentially drop below your life point threshold, and thus you'll be having the attack of your monster. But in a lot of cases, you don't really care, and you just want to get in a ton of damage and also have a big beater on your side of the field. And Megamorph is great for that. Now, all of these equip spells do suffer from Mystical Space Typhoon being at 3 in this format. Mystical Space Typhoon is a great way to punish these equip spells. If you equip it to a monster and then attack into one of your opponents expecting to get over it, and your opponent activates Mystical Space Typhoon to clear the equip spell, that can be really, really devastating for you. But these cards can all be potentially very, very good for you in a variety of decks, so I figured I'd mention them here. If you want to play attack boosters that don't necessarily lose out to Mystical Space Typhoon, then there is a quick play spell in this format that could be for you, which is Rush Recklessly. Now, Rush Recklessly doesn't necessarily boost as high as Act of Despair or Megamorph would. It only increases the attack of a monster by 700, but it does have some other benefits. Firstly, it can't be telegraphed and then MST'd like an equip spell would be. Secondly, it can also be used in the damage step, so your opponent can't activate Woboku in response to it if you activate in the damage step. And thirdly, you can actually activate it from your hand in the battle phase, just potentially surprising your opponent completely out of nowhere and getting in a powerful attack. So, Rush Recklessly is great for people who want to boost their attack with a powerful attack boost, but don't necessarily want to play into Mystical Space Typhoon and the like. Speaking of cards that can potentially be bad for equipped spells, we also have another quick play spell in this format called Tailor of the Fickle. Now, I think this is a really interesting card. Basically, what it does is switch the target of one equipped spell to another valid target, which can be very good if your opponent's attacking in with something like Acts of Despair. You activate Tailor of the Fickle, switch it to be equipped to your own monster. That can be a major blow against your opponent. So it's very good in that respect. It can also be used on things like Snatch Steal, potentially switching your opponent's Snatch Steal target to a much weaker monster. So, Tailor of the Fickle, very interesting card to consider if you're potentially siding against an equip spell strategy. But in general, I don't really think it's worth playing in the main deck, as not every deck is on equip spells, but definitely worth considering in the side. And it also does have some other uses if you are playing a bit more of an equip strategy, which we'll get to when we discuss that strategy. The last of the spells that I want to discuss here is Messenger of Peace. Now, of course, this does have more use in stall-based strategies, as it is a floodgate, stopping your opponent from attacking with powerful attack monsters. But I think it also could have potentially general use, much like a Swords of Revealing Light. Now, it's a bit less good than Swords of Revealing Light, in my opinion, as it does only affect monsters with 1500 or more attack, and there are a lot of monsters played in a variety of decks in this format that do have less than 1500 attack, so this might not be the best. But if your opponent is playing a bit more of an aggressive strategy, you can bring this in to basically serve as a one-sided floodgate that you can get rid of at any time. It does die to Mystical Space Typhoon, but it might be worth playing regardless. And of course, if you are a stall strategy, then this card is potentially very good for you. Although, as I said, it may not be the best. Moving on to the traps, Magic Ruler didn't really introduce many powerful traps, but it did introduce some potentially interesting ones. Fairy's Hand Mirror is a card that's great for countering equipped spells as well. It says when your opponent activates a spell that targets exactly one monster on the field, target another card that would be appropriate, and the spell now targets that new target. Now, this can be used to potentially switch around your opponent's equipped spells, much like Tailor of the Fickle, but it can also be used on things like Change of Heart. Now, besides Change of Heart, I don't really know what else this would do that Taylor the Fickle could not do, but if you are worried about change of heart, this can be pretty good. The other trap this format may be worth considering, especially in like a stall-based strategy, is Spellbinding Circle. This is a continuous trap that you activate by targeting one monster your opponent controls. It can't attack or change its battle position, and when that monster is destroyed, destroy this card. So this can be used to stop your opponent's aggressive pressure, maybe Spellbinding Circle a big beater, or it could even be used if your opponent is bringing out a more defensive card off of a recruiter. For instance, if your opponent brings out a Labyrinth Wall off of a Giant Rat, you can Spellbinding Circle to make sure that Labyrinth Wall is going to stay in attack position instead of switching to defense position. Very niche application of this card, and I think in general this card is not really worth playing in the main deck or even in the side deck, but it is a card that could potentially see play and could potentially be useful. So that's why I'm mentioning it here. So these are sort of the cards that you could maybe play generically in a sort of generic deck, but there are also some cards that released that sort of benefit their own strategy and not really anything else, and some new strategies at that. So let's discuss some of those new strategies now, starting with one that I've mentioned a lot here, Equip. Now, as I mentioned before, Magic Ruler introduced a lot of very powerful equip spells into the game, and it also introduced some cards that are based around equip spells. So it's very interesting that you can actually make your own equip strategy here, although I'm not necessarily sure it's optimal to use all these cards in that equip strategy. The big monster that's related to these equip spells is one called Mahavelo, and this is a monster that gains 500 attack for each equip card equipped to this card. Now, this may seem pretty good, as you could potentially just overload this card with a ton of equip spells and get this attack up to a very high amount. But in practice, I think this card is actually not as worth playing as just a big beater like something like Jiraigumo or Dark Elf, which can both manipulate your life points to get yourself in Megamorph range, and can also just get to a higher attack than Mahavelo can. You know, you can get to a pretty decent attack stat by overloading this card with a bunch of equip spells, but you could just get to a higher attack stat by equipping one Jiraigumo or Dark Elf with a Megamorph, and then you're set. In addition, going all in on one monster like that is very risky in this format, as things like Cyberjar exist, which can just clear it away, and you've lost a ton of investment in that case. Sure, there are equip spells that can recover themselves to the top of the deck, but honestly, in most cases, you don't necessarily want to do that. And those equip spells can actually miss timing, which is very interesting to see, and is a ruling that actually hasn't come up yet so far. Basically, what I mean by missing the timing is that if you have a monster equipped with something like an Axe of Despair, which when it's sent from the field to the graveyard can tribute a monster to add it to the top of the deck, if you have that monster equipped with Axe of Despair and you attack into something like a Cyberjar, and the Cyberjar effect goes off, destroying all monsters on the field, and thus sending Axe of Despair to the graveyard as well, and then special summoning out monsters onto the field, then you can't actually activate Axe of Despair, as the last thing that's happened was not Axe of Despair being sent to the graveyard, but instead monsters being special summoned to your side of the field. So this is a bit of a tricky ruling that almost never comes up, as in these cases you don't generally want to add Axe of Despair to the top of the deck. But whenever you have an effect that's worded as when something happens, you can do this, you have to make sure that the when condition is the last thing that actually happened before doing the you can effect. So Axe of Despair and something like Malevolent Nuzzler, and I'm pretty sure Horn of Light, although it's written in pre-problem solving card text, I'm pretty sure. So, you know, if it doesn't do this, then please correct me in the comments. But all three of these cards can miss the timing in the case of something like a Cyberjar, which actually does come up in this format quite a bit, even though you might not necessarily want to use these effects when it does. Speaking of Horn of Light, let's start discussing some of the other equip spells in this set, as I've already discussed 3 major ones, but there were some additional ones as well that you might consider playing if you're going all in on equips. Horn of Light is a spell that's very interesting, as it increases the defense of a monster equipped by 800. So if you want to go a bit more defensive, this card can be a good way to do that. In all honesty, I don't really think it's worth it, as equipped spells decks are generally trying to get more aggressive, but you could potentially play it, and it could potentially be tough for your opponent to get over a monster equipped with it. So something to consider if you do want to go a bit more defensive with your equipped deck. Another equipped spell that increases defense, and is also a horn, is Horn of the Unicorn. Now, this is a spell that also increases attack, so it's a bit better than Horn of Light. but it does have a major downside. So you might wonder why I'm recommending Malevolent Nuzzler over this card, as this card increases the monster's attack and defense by 700, so you'd think it was strictly better than Malevolent Nuzzler, but when it's sent from the field to the graveyard, it automatically returns to the top of the deck. You don't get a choice in it. And that does mean that it does do this if Cyberjar is activated, but it also means that you are sort of locking yourself out of a better draw for the next turn. And if your opponent does manage to get the aggressive upper hand here and destroy whatever monster you have equipped with Horn of the Unicorn, you aren't going to be able to draw a way to deal with that for at least one turn, which can be very rough. So overall, I think Horn of the Unicorn is a card that may seem very tempting, but it's actually not very good and should just generally be avoided unless you do actually want to recycle it every turn, which I don't think is very good. The last equip spell I want to talk about here is Black Pendant. Black Pendant is very interesting. It increases a monster's attack by 500, which is not as good as the other attack boosts, but when it's sent from the field to the graveyard, you actually inflict 500 damage to your opponent. This means that it can have application in some burn decks, for instance, and it can potentially wind up dealing more damage than something like Malevolent Nuzzler would, because if you attack into an opponent's monster with it, and then your opponent immediately removes that monster the next turn, they're taking 1,000 extra damage as opposed to just 700. So this is a good card to consider. I think in general, if you're going for this sort of equip-focused deck, you want to focus on maximizing attack instead of maximizing damage. But it's a very subtle distinction, and so you may definitely want to play this card. This card also will not miss the timing as well, since it's not a when you can effect. Of course, as I mentioned before, Tailor of the Fickle is a card that can play very well with these equip spells. You can potentially, if you're attacking with more than one monster, Tailor of the Fickle one equip spell from one to the other to get in even more damage, which can be really devastating. But it also has some other more jank applications as well. So I've already mentioned how this card can be used when a Snapsteal is activated to switch the target to a weaker target. And this actually does have a bit of jank that can be associated with it, as there are two monsters in this set, Amoeba and Griggle, which actually have effects when they switch from your control to your opponent's. Griggle's effect is, in my opinion, the worst effect. It says that when it shifts control to your opponent, you increase your life points by 3,000. And its effect can only be used once one is face up on the field. So if your opponent's Snapsteal is destroyed, then they won't then gain 3,000 life points. But, you know, you're already gaining life points from the Snapsteal, so I don't really think that this is as good as the other monster that switches control, which is Amoeba, which says that when control of this face-up card on the field switches to your opponent, inflict 2,000 points of damage to your opponent's life points. So this can be used as sort of a burn card, which can be pretty good. Now, I'm pretty sure this card works the way that I'm setting out, where it will actually inflict damage to your opponent instead of you. But it's a bit iffy because it takes effect kind of in the interim when it's switching to your opponent. So I don't actually know if this effect then activates targeting you as the opponent, because you are now the opponent of this card's controller. It's a really weird sort of middle ground. I'm pretty sure it works the way I've set forward, but if it doesn't, please let me know in the comments, as then this strategy is kind of just dead in the water. You know, there's no way to pull it off. There's no reason to pull it off, as it just benefits your opponent. But if it does work the way that I've set forth, then it could be a potentially fun jank option to include. I don't think it's a good jank option to include, but it is one you can go with. So I thought I'd mention it here. In addition, while we're talking about other monsters that you could potentially play in this equip strategy, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Masked Sorcerer and White Magical Hat. Now, I mentioned that in general, these equip strategies generally want to buff up a monster to get in a ton of damage, but they can also be used to boost up the attack of White Magical Hat and Masked Sorcerer to potentially get in draws or discards respectively. Now, I think this is the less good usage for the equip strategy. I've tried it out. I don't think it is as good, but, you know, you can go this direction if you want to. So I thought I'd mention it here. The last equip-related card that I wanted to mention here is a card that you can both use in an equip strategy and against an equip strategy, which is Eternal Rest. Now, Eternal Rest is a spell card that says destroy all monsters equipped with equip cards. So this can be very good if your opponent is on an equip deck of their own and they've got all their monsters equipped. You can Eternal Rest to potentially clear their entire board. But you can also use this as an equip card player, potentially equipping your opponent's monsters with your additional equip spells, and just Eternal Resting to clear them away from the board to potentially get in for a major damage push. So it's a very interesting card in that respect. If you do use it to do that, you're kind of using up a lot of resources, but it can potentially be worth it if you're getting in a major aggressive push off of it. So an interesting card to consider. But while this is a strategy that can be also applied to more generic decks as well, there are some strategies that Magic Ruler introduced that are kind of doing their own thing. So let's cover some of them now. Now, this isn't a new strategy that Magic Ruler introduced, but various stall decks did get buffed by new cards coming in Magic Ruler. And this includes both mill and burn, so I figured I'd just cover them in the same category, as they do potentially share some defensive options, so I figured I'd talk about them here. Of course, let's start with mill, as I think mill received a bit more exciting support. Maybe not better support, but it is exciting and it really does revitalize the stall mill strategy. Of course, the main support that mill received was Cyberjar. Now, Cyberjar is great at both clearing away your opponent's field, but also having them draw 5 cards potentially. You might wonder, wait, why is this actually great? And the reason for that is you can then get a majorly powerful card destruction off of them with a ton of cards in their hand. And if you compare this with something like Spear Cretin to keep getting that Cyberjar back, then they can just keep drawing cards and potentially decking themselves out very easily. So we'll get into a potential mill deck that does this later on in the video, which I think is pretty sick, even if it's not the best deck in the format. But I think that this is a very powerful mill tool and really increases the power level of the deck. Another mill tool I want to talk about is Hero's Shadow Scout. Now, this is a bit less good of a mill tool, but it may actually be more beneficial than Cyberjar in this format. So, Hero's Shadow Scout reads that your opponent draws 3 cards, both players look at the cards, and if there are any spell cards among them, discard all those spell cards to the graveyard. Now, one of the big flaws with using a Cyberjar to mill out your opponent is that if they have any power spells from those mills, then they get to add those spells to hand to potentially wreak havoc on your board later. With Hero's Shadow Scout, however, they don't get that benefit. So, while Hero's Shadow Scout doesn't necessarily mill them as much as Cyberjar does, it could potentially mill them more effectively. However, it also doesn't play as well with card destruction as Cyberjar does, and it doesn't clear away your opponent's board, so it may not defend you as well as Cyberjar does either. But it's definitely a card for mill decks to consider and experiment with going forward. And I mentioned this card earlier, but it definitely deserves mention now. Gravekeeper's Servant can also be a powerful tool in mill to sort of mill out your opponent that way, as each time they attack, they'll have to send a card from deck to grave. Now, 1 card each time they attack may not seem like much, but it can add up pretty quickly. The only unfortunate downside to this is that there is so much spell and trap removal in the format that you're unlikely to actually get this off that much. So, I personally don't really like Gravekeeper's Servant as much in the mill deck as some other people might, but it is definitely a card to consider, and a card that can be very powerful if your opponent doesn't draw the spell and trap removal for it. Burn strategies also received some major support in this format, of course with things like Giant Germ, just dealing 500 life points to your opponent every time it's destroyed by battle, but also through powerful spell cards like Chain Energy, which makes the burn deck actually insane. So Chain Energy is a continuous spell that reads each player must pay 500 life points per card to normal summon, special summon, set, or activate cards from his or her respective hand. Now, this is actually insane because, first of all, if you double or triple up your Chain Energies on field, that's costing your opponent 1,000 to 1,500 life points to activate a card from hand, which means that if you've got all 3 out, they can only activate 5 cards over the course of the game before they basically lose. So this can be incredibly strong in multiples, but even on its own, it can mess with the math a bit, especially going first. If you activate this first turn, that can be incredibly devastating for your opponent, and they might not even be able to recover given how much initial damage they may take just trying to set up their board. So, Chain Energy, very powerful card, and if your opponent gets down to low enough life points, it can just potentially lock them out of the game, as if they're beneath the 500 threshold, they won't be able to do anything. So this card makes burn relatively insane, even if there are a lot more spell and trap removal options in the format. Now, when I say insane, I don't mean like the best deck, of course, but it is still a very good deck, and a deck to consider, especially given that it has other tools as well. Toll is another card that's very similar to Chain Energy, where it says that each player must pay 500 life points to declare an attack. So where Chain Energy sort of punishes bringing cards out from hand, Toll punishes doing actions on field, namely attacking, which is something that your opponent is going to want to do to potentially try to out-aggro you before they're burned to death. So Toll is a very useful card in this deck. Maybe not as good as Chain Energy, as your opponent can just bide their time until they draw into spell and trap removal, and it's less of a threat than Chain Energy is, in my opinion, as it doesn't lock them out of the game as much, but it is still a very good card to consider in a burn deck. There are some additional monsters that burn as well, but they're a bit less good. Jigen Bakudan is a flip monster that is very, very strange. It says after this card is flipped, offer it as a tribute during your standby phase to destroy all monsters on your side of the field and inflict direct damage equal to half of the total attack of the destroyed monsters, excluding this monster, to your opponent's life points. This could potentially be a good payout if you have a bunch of big beaters on the field. This can sort of serve the same purpose as a Catapult Turtle, just a lot slower. But whereas the Catapult Turtle can sort of enable an OTK, this card just sort of represents a very telegraphed and very easily stopped sort of burn bomb that your opponent can very much play around. So if your opponent has any sort of removal to get rid of this card, then they can just remove it from field and it won't be able to attribute itself for its effect, and thus won't deal any damage. Also, you have to wait a turn to actually activate its effect if you flip it up yourself. And if your opponent's attacking into it, they're likely attacking into it with a monster with above 1,000 attack. So it will be destroyed unless you use something like a Woboku or a defense booster, which we'll get to in a second. So it's very likely that you won't even be able to pull off its effect. And in order to actually get enough value out of its effect to make it worthwhile, you need to commit a lot of monsters to board. And so it's like, I don't really think it's that good. It takes way too much setup to basically be a worse Catapult Turtle, but it is a card you can consider if you want to. We also have Electric Snake's much worse cousin, Minar. Now, Minar is a card that when it's discarded from your hand at the graveyard by the effect of a card controlled by your opponent, you inflict 1,000 points of damage to your opponent's life points. So, this also punishes like a Delinquent Duo, just like Electric Snake does, but it inflicts burn instead of actually drawing you cards. So, in my opinion, it's a bit less good than Electric Snake in most scenarios, but if you are playing a burn deck, you could potentially play it. I don't think it's very good. Funnily enough, it does actually have a decent matchup against Mill, though, because if you're able to deplete the Mill player's life points down to 1,000, you could potentially kill them before they can deck you out. So, it's interesting in that regard, I guess. But in general, I think this card is not really worth playing. In addition to these sort of cards that are specifically geared towards mill and burn respectively, there are also some very powerful other stall tools that you can use. For instance, Nimble Manga, which I've mentioned before, is a great stall tool. It brings out 2 more blockers on field when it's destroyed by battle, and it also boosts up your life points by a lot as well. So this card can be very, very good in that context. In addition, if you are playing burn, it can also be Cannon Soldier fodder, which is very useful as well. And you can also potentially loop this back with something like a Spear Cretin, which is very good in all of these stallier decks, and just recycling your powerful flip monsters, and also potentially dealing more damage by recycling a Giant Germ, or recycling a Nimble Manga to heal yourself up a bit. So, Nimble Manga, I think, is a great tool in a lot of different stall decks, and definitely something to consider. There are also a bunch of spells that enable you to get a bit more defensive here. So if you are trying to build a deck that just stalls out with some big defenders, these are the tools for you. Firstly, we've got Chorus of Sanctuary, which is a field spell that increases the defense of all defense position monsters by 500 points, which can boost up a 2k defender like Giant Soldier of Stone to a 2,500 defense point monster, which can be very tough for your opponents to get over, as even something like a Jiraiya won't quite get over it. Now, it's not completely insurmountable. For instance, if your opponent has an equipped spell like Act of Despair, then your opponent can still get over it. But if you're playing something like a Labyrinth Wall, then that will be able to block the attack that way. In addition, in terms of defense, we also have the Reliable Guardian here, which can be very useful. It's a quick play spell like Rush Recklessly that boosts the defense of a monster on your side of the field by 700 points until the end of this turn. So this can be used in the damage step to boost up your defense position monsters and prevent them from being destroyed. and it can also be a great counter to something like Rush Recklessly. However, I think just going all in on the defense boosting options are not very good, especially given all the spell and trap removal in this format, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend playing them, but they are there if you want to go that way. In addition, I've already mentioned Messenger of Peace as a potential stall tool, and I've already mentioned how it can be a bit flawed in that if your opponent's not playing super aggressive monsters, then they can just get under Messenger of Peace and it won't do you any good. But this card can serve as a floodgate against more aggressive decks, so it might be something that you want to have in the side deck potentially. Two last cards I want to mention. Black Pendant can be very good in the burn deck as well as sort of a safeguard. If you set this card along with your sort of Chain Energy and Toll Floodgates, and your opponent tries activating a Heavy Storm, they could be burned for more damage than they're expecting with this card. And also you can use it to boost up the attack of your monsters to potentially deal damage that way. But I'm not really sure it's worth including in a burn deck, as the deck space in that sort of deck can be a bit tight, and there are more effective burn cards that you can chain to Heavy Storm instead, something like Just Desserts potentially. And the last card I want to mention is a card that can actually be very devastating to deal with as a mill deck, although in this current iteration of mill, I don't actually think it's that bad. And that card is Penguin Knight. So Penguin Knight is a monster that when sent directly from your deck to the graveyard by the effect of a card controlled by your opponent, you unite your graveyard and your own deck, shuffle them up, and form a new deck. So this can be very good as a counter if your mill player is playing Gravekeeper's Servant, for instance, as that can potentially mill it from the deck. But most of the time, the mill deck is not actually sending cards directly from your deck to the graveyard. Instead, using things like Card Destruction and Cyberjar to make you draw a ton of cards and deplete your deck that way. So I honestly don't think Penguin Knight is that good as an anti-mill tech in this format, but it is something to consider, I guess. But I think that honestly, if you're putting in an anti-mill card here, you'd be much better off using something like Sword of Deep-Seated or even Cockroach Knight. But now that we've covered the boons that stall strategies have gained in this format, let's talk about the new cards that tribal strategies have gained in this format. Now, while tribal strategies I don't think are that good in this format, they did get some cards to help them out a little bit. The foremost among them being the Attributal Recruiters. Now, I've already mentioned three of them, Mystic Tomato, Shining Angel, and Giant Rat. But there are three others for the three remaining attributes, and those are Flying Kamakiri number 1 for wind, Mother Grizzly for water, and UFO Turtle for fire. Now, honestly, there aren't really anything good to fetch with these, but if you are playing a tribal strategy of a given attribute, then they can be pretty good. For instance, in Metal Raiders, they released sort of attribute boosting monsters, things like Bladefly, or Hoshiningen, Little Chimera, Mindless Radiant, Starboy, and Witch's Apprentice. So you could potentially fetch these out with any of the attributal recruiters and potentially boost up your other monsters of a given attribute that way. But besides that, for the other attributal recruiters, there really isn't too much to grab. For water, I guess there is Catapult Turtle that you can bring out as sort of an aggressive burning strategy. You could also bring out like Aqua Matador as well if you just valued the defense. But there really isn't anything else here, as water tribal decks in the past have more focused on the bigger monsters like 7-colored fish or great white. For fire, there are some interesting options, I guess, but nothing too good. You could fetch out a Blast Juggler if you want to get rid of your opponent's monsters with less than 1,000 attack during your standby phase. I guess that's a potential usage for UFO Turtle, although I feel like that's very, very situational. You could also fetch out a Dragon Piper if you want to get a bit more defensive with a fire deck, as I believe 1800 is the highest defense on a fire monster so far, with 1500 or less attack. But frankly, neither of those are that good, and there's nothing really good to get with the fire recruiter. Wind, there actually is a bit of an option here. Harpy Lady can be fetched off of Flying Kamakiri number 2, and is sort of the basis of its own Harpy Lady strategy, which I covered in Critter format. So you could potentially play the Harpy strategy again, using things like Flying Kamakiri number 1 to fetch it out, and also potentially things like the attributal field spells, which I'll cover in 1 second. Before that, I want to mention one last thing you could fetch out with Mystic Tomato that I didn't cover in the more generic uses of it, because I don't really think it's that good generically. It can be. It can definitely be a card you play in a generic deck. I have seen it played in generic decks before. but it's more of a defensive option like Labyrinth Wall is for Giant Rat, and that is Castle of Dark Illusions. Castle of Dark Illusions is the dark monster in this format with the highest amount of defense, so you could just fetch it off of a Mystic Tomato and then switch it to defense for the next turn. So I thought I'd mention that here, because I didn't mention that in the general uses of Mystic Tomato previously. However, playing defensive monsters like this can actually have negative synergy with the field spells now present in this format. So this format introduced one field spell for each attribute to sort of boost their attack by 500. Gaia Power for Earth, Luminous Spark for Light, Molten Destruction for Fire, Mystic Plasma Zone for Dark, Rising Air Current for Wind, and Umiruka for Water. Each of these boosts their respective attribute by 500 attack and decreases the defense by 400. So if you are trying to go with a bit more defensive strategy, then these cards don't really play well with that. But they can be used to get a ton of damage on board and make your monsters very hard for your opponent to get over. Especially for the Harpy Lady deck, Rising Air Current is definitely a boon. Being able to just make that big aggressive push with your Harpy Lady sisters at 2450 attack is very, very good. Although I think that deck has other problems in this format because the hand rips can rip out your combo pieces, and that can be very, very bad. But if you really do want to make a tribal deck using these tools, they are here for you to do. I just don't think that they're very good this format, just like they weren't very good in Critter either. Speaking of not good strategies though, Magic Ruler also introduced some new strategies that are also not very good at this point. They may get better once the limited list gets introduced, but right now they're not very good. So let's discuss them just for the sake of completeness. Firstly, we've got Ritual Monsters. Now, Ritual Monsters are a new type of monster introduced in this set, which have a slew of problems, especially in MRL format. So the way Ritual Monsters work is that you can't normal summon or special summon them on their own. You have to use a Ritual spell card. And the Ritual spell cards basically say that you can special summon the Ritual monster out by triggering monsters in your hand or on your field with level greater than or equal to the Ritual monster itself. So for instance, if you're Ritual summoning out a monster like Hungry Burger with 6 stars with Hamburger Recipe, you'll need a combined level of 6 or more to bring it out. This can be pretty decent because you're able to bring out a powerful monster out of nowhere basically, but a lot of the Ritual monsters in this set are underwhelming. And in addition, in this set in particular, if your opponent is using the hand rips and they rip out either the Ritual spells or Ritual monsters from your hand, that can be pretty devastating. So I don't think that the Ritual strategy is actually good this format. Maybe next format it can potentially do something, but this format it just isn't that good. But that doesn't take away from the fact that they are introduced and they did receive some decent support. So let's cover that now. Firstly, to cover the Ritual monsters themselves, we've got arguably the best one in Relinquished. Now, Relinquished is the only Ritual monster that has an actual effect attached to it, and it's a pretty good one. Of course, it can be Ritual summoned with Black Illusion Ritual, but once per turn, you can target one monster your opponent controls and equip that target to this card. And this card's attack and defense become equal to the equipped monster's attack and defense. If this card would be destroyed by battle, destroy that equipped monster instead. And while equipped with that monster, any battle damage that you take from battles involving this card inflicts equal effect damage to your opponent, which can make this card really versatile and very interesting. As a note, this card can also equip set monsters that your opponent has, but if it does, then its attack and defense will be recorded as 0/0, which isn't the worst as your opponent does take damage from attacking into this card while it's equipped with a monster. So Relinquished is a very, very unique card. Unfortunately, I don't think it's that good this format given all the hand rips disrupting its combos, but I think that in the next format it could potentially have legs. So very interesting to consider and see here. Also, the fact that it only needs 1 star total to Ritual summon it out makes it much easier to summon than some of the other Ritual monsters in the set. Now, there are 2 Ritual monsters with a level of 6, those being Hungry Burger and Performance of Sword. However, Hungry Burger has more attack and equal defense as Performance of Sword. So it's basically a just strictly better card. So that's why I'm mentioning it here over Performance of Sword. I guess you could play both if you want to, but there's no real reason to. But honestly, even though it is the better card, it isn't that good. You know, it's only got 2,000 attack. So if you really wanted to play a 2,000 attacker, you could just play like Jiraiguma or Dark Elf instead, and that would probably be better. It would cost less investment, and, you know, I guess it's not a special summon, so Hungry Burger does dodge around Trap Hole and can potentially be extra cannon soldier fodder out of nowhere. But in general, I don't think that this card is really worth playing. However, if you are potentially using like level 6, then this can be made with 2 level 3 monsters. For instance, like if you've got 2 Sangans, that can get you there. Also, if you're playing like Summon Skulls, maybe as part of a Soul Exchange or just Change of Heart Snatch Deal deck that is tributing off monsters they take for tribute monsters, then you could potentially include Hungry Burger and Hamburger Recipe, as you'll have plenty of easy 6s to tribute for it. But I think in general, Hungry Burger just isn't worth it overall. If you're going to play a ritual monster that's not relinquished, I think the more worthwhile one might be Crab Turtle. Crab Turtle is a level 8 ritual monster with 2550 attack, which actually is bigger than any level 6 or lower monster you can bring out otherwise. Summon Skulls the max attack on a level 6 monster, and that's only 2500. This is 50 more, so maybe there's an argument for it in that way. But this is a level 8 monster, so you need to tribute monsters that total level 8 or more with Turtle Oath. And you could potentially play this in a deck playing something like Blue Eyes White Dragons, like maybe a dragon deck, as you'll likely have access to level 8 monsters. Or you could just tribute multiple weaker monsters, like 2 Witch of the Black Forest, for instance, or even 2 Thunder Dragon. Now, Thunder Dragon, I think, is very much a consideration in these ritual strategies, as it provides easy ritual fodder and does deck thin to enable you to draw into your ritual monsters and ritual pieces more easily. However, there are some other monsters introduced in this set that enables you to just add the ritual monsters and spells to hand directly, so those are probably better to use in those cases. Those monsters are Senju of the Thousand Hands and Sonic Bird respectively. Both have 1400 attack, 1000 defense, and they each have a very similar effect. When either is normal or flip summoned, in the case of Senju, you can add 1 ritual monster from deck to hand, and in the case of Sonic Bird, you can add 1 ritual spell from deck to hand. Now, I think in general, this makes Sonic Bird the more useful of the two, as you can potentially search a ritual monster through other means. For instance, both Sangan and Witch of the Black Forest can search out Relinquished as a monster with 0 attack and defense. So I think if you're playing a Relinquished deck, you don't necessarily need Senju, but I guess it is another way to find Relinquished, so it can be useful in that case. And also, if you are playing one of the bigger ritual monsters, then this can be a good card to include, as there are no real other ways to search them. So these additional monsters can make the ritual decks a bit more consistent. However, I don't actually think that makes them good enough to be considered playable in this format. Maybe next format, though. Magic Ruler also introduced another unique strategy into the game that I think is arguably worse than Rituals, although that is up for debate. But since we're covering this to completeness, let's cover that as well. In addition to ritual monsters, Magic Ruler also introduced a new type of monster called Toons. Now, these Toons are very interesting as they revolve around the continuous spell Toon World. Now, Toon World is a spell that doesn't do anything on the surface. You just activate it by paying 1000 life points, which may seem very underwhelming, and to be fair, it is. And you might even wonder what's the purpose of this card. Well, the reason why it exists is because the Toons can only be brought out while it's on the field. And what makes this so powerful is that the Toons can actually be special summoned out directly from the hand when it's on the field. So the base level Toon monster that you're going to be using is Toon Mermaid. Toon Mermaid is a level 4 monster, which means that you don't have to tribute any other monsters to bring it out. You can just special summon it out whenever Toon World's on the field, which can be very useful even though it has not the best attack at only 1400. The next level up is Toon Summon Skull, which is a level 6 monster, so you can special summon it out by tributing 1 monster on your side of the field. And it has 2500 attack, which is pretty decent on a monster you can just special summon out pretty easily. Moving up to the 2 tribute monsters, we have Manga Ryuran and Blue Eyes Toon Dragon, both of which need 2 tributes to special summon out. And of the 2, Blue Eyes is much better. Manga Ryuran has slightly higher defense, but in general, you aren't really playing these Toons for defense, you're playing them for attack. So I think if you're going to include a 2 tribute 2 monster in your deck, Blue Eyes Toon Dragon is the better choice, as 3000 attack is nothing to scoff at. Now, each of the Toon monsters has a certain restriction attached to it, and it's the same restriction, so I'm just going to cover it on one. The turn that they're special summoned, they can't actually attack, and you must pay 500 life points to declare an attack with that monster. If Toon World on the field is destroyed, then the Toon monsters are destroyed as well. But if it isn't, and if you manage to stick a Toon monster on field for more than one turn, you can attack your opponent directly with these monsters. However, if they control a Toon monster as well, you must target that Toon monster for its attacks. So these can be very powerful at setting up a big board and just dealing a ton of damage to your opponent on the next turn if they don't have a way to deal with it. And for that reason, they could potentially be good with a bunch of counter traps, things like Magic Jammer or Solemn Judgment, which can allow you to stop both your opponent's Heavy Storms and Mystical Space Typhoons, clearing Toon World, and also any board clears like Raigeki and Dark Hole. Because if you manage to get these monsters to stick for more than one turn, it can be very powerful. In addition, their swarming capability can also make them great Cannon Soldier fodder. I think Cannon Soldier is an instant include in any Toon deck, as it's the perfect thing to bring out after you've made a ton of direct attacks with your Toon monsters and just have a bunch of monsters on board to tribute away to finish off that last remaining bit of life points that your opponent has left. There are also some interesting synergies with some other cards. Giant Trunade, for instance, can bounce Toon World back to hand, which won't actually destroy your Toon monsters, as they only say when Toon World is destroyed, they're destroyed. In addition, since they can't attack the turn that they're summoned, Soul Exchange is a reasonable consideration in this deck, as you can sort of tribute away your opponent's monsters for material, and the no battle phase condition doesn't really phase you as they can't attack anyways. So there are a lot of interesting things you can do with the Toon monsters in Toon World, but overall I think the deck is really hurt by the large amount of spell and trap removal in the format, and the amount of life points and resources that you have to put into bringing these monsters out onto the field. So I don't think the Toon strategy is that good right now. Maybe it will get better in later formats, but right now I don't really think it's worth covering in MRL format. Now, I've covered most of the cards in Magic Ruler at this point, but there are a couple cards that I haven't talked about yet, because they just don't really fit in anywhere else. So let's just go over those before I dive into some example deck lists and give my final thoughts on the format as a whole. Oh boy, this set had a bunch of stinkers in them. You know, I could have even put more cards on this list if I hadn't found ways to sneak them into other sections of this video beforehand. That is how bad the bad cards in this set were. You know, it made up for it by having some of the most broken cards introduced into the game thus far, but, you know, you could arguably call these cards broken as well, but in a very different way. So let's just start diving into them. Now, first thing to note about Magic Ruler is that it introduced a set of level 4 monsters that have some very powerful attack stats, but have major detriments that make them basically unplayable. The first of which is Boar Soldier. If this card's normal summon, destroy this card. And if your opponent controls one or more monsters, decrease the attack of this card by 1,000 points. So in most cases, this card is just going to be an 1,000 attack point monster, which is very easy for your opponent to beat over. And you got to do setup to actually bring it out, setting it first or potentially bring it back with a monster reborn. So it's just not very good at all. I guess you could use this as a potential trigger for Last Will, as you just summon it out, it blows itself up, you Last Will out another monster that's better. So I guess you could use it for a combo like that. But Cannon Soldier is a much better Last Will trigger than Boar Soldier, as at least it's dealing 500 damage to your opponent and can have other uses outside of just being a trigger for Last Will. So I think this card is pretty terrible. A card that is a bit less terrible, but is still kind of questionable, is Dark Zebra. Now this is a monster with 1800 attack, so it ties with something like Lodge-In or 7-colored Fish. And if it's the only card in your control during your standby phase, it's automatically placed in defense position. Now, this might not come up often, because you could sort of set spell and trap cards to sort of keep it in attack position, or you could also just summon it when you already have other monsters on field. But it is kind of like, why would you play a monster like this with a detriment, when you could just play something like Lodge-In or 7-colored Fish with no detriment? And, I mean, I guess at the time, Mechanical Chaser was a very hard card to acquire, but playing this format nowadays makes Mechanical Chaser a lot easier to play with, and why would you play this when you've got Mechanical Chaser, Lodge-In, and 7-colored Fish? There's no real reason to fit this into a deck that I can see, unless you really want to go all out on, you know, the 1800, 1850 beaters without too bad of a side effect, because compared to some other cards, this downside isn't the worst. But it's just kind of like, why would you play this over the other cards already in this format? The last of these monsters is Flash Assailant, which I will admit does make for some jank fun. Flash Assailant is a monster that says decrease the attack and defense of this card by 400 points for each card in hand. So if you have no cards in hand, it's a 2000 beater. That's great. If you've got at least one card in hand, it's 1600 or less, which is not very good for a beater. However, there are some very jank combos you can do with this. For instance, Reverse Trap can be used to boost this card up to over 2000 attack points, which could be a very neat interaction. And in general, you could just set your hand of spell and trap cards, bring out a Flash Assailant, and you've got a 2000 beater with basically no downside. However, I think in general, this card is just not very good and it's just too jank to be playable, although that won't stop people from trying. But speaking on all of these level 4 detrimental monsters, I think that if you're going to play a level 4 monster with a detriment, you're going to want to play something like Generically instead, as this has the highest attack out of all of them, and can also potentially have some combos with things like Megamorph and the like. So if you're going aggro and making a level 4 beat stick deck, Generically is probably the way to go, maybe even Dark Elf as well. Moving on though, away from those level 4 beaters, we have Kotodama, which is a very interesting card, but not a very good card. So this is a monster with 0 attack and 1600 defense that says if there are face-up monsters with the same name on the field, destroy those monsters. And then there's, a bit about how this actually works when there are multiple monsters on the field, when this card's flipped up, or if multiple monsters with the same name are summoned at the same time. That doesn't really matter as much. What matters is this card is really bad. It can serve some uses, I guess, like very situational uses. But most of the time, your opponent isn't going to have multiple monsters on the field with the same name. And if they do, this card can be crazy, but given how situational it is, it's probably not worth including in your deck. And if you do summon this out to clear away those monsters, your opponent will likely have another monster that can just attack over this anyways. So I don't really think that this is worth playing at all. But it is an interesting card, I guess, to consider, as it does have some very situational uses. A similarly situational card is Weather Report. Weather Report is a flip monster that, when it's flipped, destroys all opponents' face-up Swords of Revealing Light, and if Swords of Revealing Light is destroyed, you can perform your battle phase twice this turn, or your next turn if it's activated during your opponent's turn. So this is an interesting way to punish Swords of Revealing Light activations, and potentially get even more aggressive with it. However, you actually have to have this card in hand when your opponent has Swords of Revealing Light. And as I've said before, Swords of Revealing Light is a lot less good in this format than it has been in previous formats, so your opponent might not even be playing swords. So even though this can be very powerful if your opponent does actually activate swords and this pops it, I think overall it's not even good enough to include in a side deck. But maybe if you're scared enough of swords that you want something to deal with it, then you could include this card, I guess. I don't know. I don't know why you wouldn't just use Mystical Space Typhoons instead. The last monster here is very much the worst of the bunch, and that is Wall Shadow. Now, Wall Shadow is a monster that can't be normal summoned or set, and must first be special summoned with the effect of Magical Labyrinth, which might get you thinking, well, what's Magical Labyrinth? Magical Labyrinth is an equip spell that you can only equip to Labyrinth Wall. You contribute the Labyrinth Wall to special summon a Wall Shadow from your deck. So you're basically equipping this to a 3k defender that you already have on field, to bring out a 3k defender that has a bit more attack, but not enough attack to actually be good. So there's no real reason to actually play this, and also it can be a major brick if you draw it, as there's no way to bring it out besides Magical Labyrinth. And also, if it's in your hand when you activate Magical Labyrinth, you can't actually bring it out. So there's really just no reason to play this. The only way you can bring it back into the deck is if your opponent activates Forceful Sentry and picks it, or if you have a Yado Karu and you switch its battle position to add it back to the deck. There's no real good way to set this card up, and there's no real reason why you'd want to either. So I think that this card is probably the worst monster in this set by a long way. Moving on to some other spell cards that are very interesting here, but not that good. We first have Curse of Fiend, which changes the battle positions of all monsters on the field, and those positions can't be changed during this turn, except by another effect. Now, what makes this card so interesting is it can only be activated during your standby phase, which means that you have to set this card beforehand, so that way it's on the field when your next standby phase comes around, and then you can activate it. This is very, very confusing, and honestly, it's not worth it, as your opponent can just Mystical Space Typhoon it away if they're worried about it. And the switching of battle positions might be nice for a turn, but you've got to do a lot of setup to actually make sure that it's advantageous for you. I guess this could be a decent side deck card in decks that want to get aggressive through more stallier defensive decks, but I feel like Stop Defense is a better card than Curse of Fiend is. So I don't think it's worth playing at all. Another card that I don't really think is worth playing is the Darkness Approaches. Now, Darkness Approaches is very interesting. It's very similar to a much better card that gets introduced later on, Book of Moon. But this card says discard 2 cards from your hand, select 1 face-up monster on the field, and change it to face-down defense position. Now, the way this used to work, and this was a very complicated ruling, was that if you targeted a face-up attack position monster, it would be set in attack position, and that was actually the only way for a while that you could have monsters set in attack position. But, you know, this just led to a bunch of weird edge cases and stuff, and so Konami decided to just revise it so that it's changed to face-down defense position. In actuality, it doesn't really matter that much, so there's no real reason to keep it as the set attack position stuff. And honestly, there's no real reason to play this card in general. I guess you could use it in a sort of mill deck to sort of reset your flip monsters after you flip them up. But the main monster that you'd want to be setting in a mill deck is Cyberjar, which blows itself up whenever it's flipped up, so you can't really get use out of it that way. I guess in a general deck, you could potentially set a Magician of Faith to get back a powerful spell later, but you're essentially using 3 cards to do this, and I don't really think that's worth it, even if you do get a powerful spell back later. So I honestly don't think this card is worth playing, but it is interesting, I guess, though, and maybe there's some jank use for it that I just am not seeing yet. The last spell that I want to talk about here is Final Destiny, which is a very interesting card. It's a discard 5 cards from your hand and destroy all cards on the field. Now, this is a major cost for a very powerful effect, to be fair. But I honestly don't think that the cost is generally worth it. I guess you could play this against mill decks, sort of if they are having you draw a bunch of cards. You can use Final Destiny to slim down your hand and also clear away their pesky set monsters. But I think if you're drawing a bunch of cards against a mill deck, they're probably killing you that turn anyways, so you probably won't have time to actually use this card. But it is an interesting card at least. I just don't think it's very good. And lastly, for the traps, we have some truly bizarre ones. Firstly, we have 2 traps that are very similar, Eat Gaboon and House of Adhesive Tape. Now, both deal with monsters with 500 or less of a given stat, but they deal with it in different ways. So Eat Gaboon enables you to destroy a monster summoned by your opponent with 500 or less attack, and House of Adhesive Tape enables you to get rid of a monster that your opponent summoned with 500 or less defense. Now, to be fair, these can actually stop special summons, which Trap Hole cannot do. So I guess your opponent like Monster Reborns, something like a Jiraigumo, House of Adhesive Tape will get more value in that situation than a Trap Hole would. But in general, Trap Hole is going to be the more useful card, as the other ways to special summon out monsters in this format generally happen in the damage step when you can't activate House of Adhesive Tape or Eat Gaboon. So like if your opponent brings out a Jiraigumo off a Cyberjar, you can't actually activate House of Adhesive Tape in that instance because it's just happening in the damage step. I'm pretty sure. You know, if I'm wrong about that, correct me in the comments down below. But that is how I think it works. And House of Adhesive Tape is only really hitting things that Trap Hole would hit. And Eat Gaboon is hitting nothing. There's basically nothing that Eat Gaboon stops. I guess Relinquished. But besides that, there's no real card that's played in this format. Oh, Magician of Faith, I guess, too. But in Magician of Faith's case, you'll already get the effect off by flipping it up. So no real need to activate this. So Eat Gaboon and House of Adhesive Tape are both really bad in this format, and I wouldn't recommend playing either. The last trap is a trap that's just outclassed by pretty much every other card that tries to do what it does in this format, and that is Snake Fang. So Snake Fang decreases one selected monster's defense by 500 points during this turn that this card is activated. So this is a card to use if you're attacking into a defense position monster. In the damage step, you can activate this, decrease the monster's defense by 500, and get over it with one of your monsters. However, this purpose is served much better by reinforcements. Reinforcements can be used in this case and in many other cases to just get over whatever monsters your opponent's got, whether they be an attack or defense. And furthermore, Reinforcements is outclassed by another card released in this set, Rush Recklessly, which increases the monster's attack by 700 instead of 500. So really, there's no reason to play Snake Fang unless you're already maxed out on Rush Recklessly and Reinforcements, and you want another way to get over your opponent's defense position monsters. It's just not very good, so I don't recommend anyone playing it. So funnily enough, I thought I'd covered every card in Spell Ruler, but there were so many bad cards and forgettable cards that there was actually one left that I forgot to cover. So let's do that now. The last card I forgot to cover is Invader of the Throne, and this card is just not very good at all. It's a flip monster that lets you swap control of one monster on your opponent's side of the field and discard. However, it can't be activated in the battle phase. So you've got to set this card with a way to stop your opponent from attacking for one turn, or I guess in a situation where you know they're not going to attack for one turn, and just hope that they've got a good monster on their side of the field to flip up and take on the next turn. I guess this can maybe see some fringe play against some more stall burn or stall mill decks, as you can take their powerful flip monsters and they're unlikely to be attacking you. But I think in general, this card is just really bad. It's very, very situational. You've got to put a ton of setup into it, and it's just not good. So it is the last card in this sort of Y section. And I just forgot about it. It's so much not a card that I would play, I don't even remember it in covering all the terrible cards in this format. So that is the last card from Magic Ruler that I haven't yet covered that actually does something unique. There are a ton of other normal monsters also introduced by Magic Ruler, but those don't really do anything unique, so I didn't cover them. But that should do it for everything that actually does something new. Now that we've covered all the cards, let's dive into what some of the better deck lists in the format are. And you'll note I didn't say best because there still is a lot of optimization that can go into these deck lists as the format is still being very much explored. So I call this deck Hand Rip because it's basically just the generic good stuff deck that's playing 6 Hand Rip cards. You know, some decks won't play as many as 6, but we're playing 6. And you could arguably call this like hand control or hand destruction. I feel like that label doesn't quite apply as well in this format as it will in later formats, as most decks are playing a lot of hand control cards, things like Forceful Sentry, Delinquent Duo, or Confiscation. So I feel kind of uncomfortable calling this that, because there's so many other decks in this umbrella. So while I do label the deck as Hand Rip in my collection here, I'm going to call this generic good stuff, because this deck really just is putting a lot of good cards together and calling it a day. And I think that there are other cards you could consider for inclusion in this main deck as well. For instance, I know people who don't like Cyberjar in the main because it benefits the opponent potentially as well, so you could potentially fit these in with Man-Eater Bugs instead. You could go more all in on spell and trap removal, fitting in giant Trunades, for instance. Like, there's a lot of stuff you could do with this deck. You could maybe even cut out Snatch Steals if you feel like your opponent's not going to be on face-up monsters. You could switch around some of the hand control cards that we're using here, maybe swapping in a Confiscation for either the Forceful Sentries or Delinquent Duos. But I'm happy with this deck as it is for now. So this deck is playing 1 Cannon Soldier, very, very good at ending the game, just like it was in Critter. 2 Cyberjars in the worst case scenario, or if we want to make a big aggressive push clearing away our opponent's monsters. 3 Magician of Faith to get back our powerful spells. There are so many powerful spells in this format that Magician of Faith is pretty much a must-have in every deck. We have 3 Mystic Tomato as well to get a bit more aggressive, and also enable us to search things like Sangan and Witch, and also Cannon Soldiers. Speaking of Sangan and Witch, we're playing 2 Sangan, 2 Witch. Very powerful cards, can search out anything that we need from our deck. And lastly, we're playing 3 Mechanical Chasers as our beaters of choice. For the spells, we're of course playing the Power 5 limited spells, Change of Heart, Dark Hole, Monster Reborn, Pot of Greed, and Raigeki. And we're also playing a bunch of other powerful spells as well. 3 Fissure to act as even more removal, 3 Delinquent Duo, and 3 Forceful Sentry as our hand rip as choice. We don't want to go all in on the 1,000 cost hand rips. It's a 6,000 damage potentially in deck that we're doing to ourselves. So we only really want to include one of the 1,000 cost hand rips. And we chose Delinquent Duo as that gets rid of more cards from our opponent's hand. But you could potentially choose Confiscation if you value the hand knowledge over actually discarding more cards. We're playing the Forceful Sentry because it's the other hand rip that doesn't cost life points. But this is arguably the best hand rip in the format anyways, and it can shuffle a card back to deck, which makes it less accessible through things like Magician of Faith, for instance. And it does get you that hand knowledge, which lets you play around what your opponent might do. For spell and trap removal, we're on 3 Heavy Storm and 3 Mystical Space Typhoon. Just very, very powerful options here. You could potentially put in True Nades as well, but I think 5 spell and trap removal cards is potentially good enough. And we're also on 3 Snap Steal to get even more aggressive, taking our opponent's face-up monsters and just getting in for a ton of damage. For the traps, we're on 1 Mirror Force because it's a crazy card in this format, even if there's a ton of spell and trap removal, and 3 Wuboku as it is chainable to spell and trap removal, and it's one of the only ways you can really stop your opponent from making a huge aggressive push out of nowhere. For the side deck, we're on 3 Jaragumo if we need to get a bit more aggressive, 3 Meteor Bug if we need more removal, 3 Giant True Nade if we need more spell and trap removal, 3 Tailor of the Fickle if we're facing an equipped style deck, this can be pretty good, and 3 Tribute to the Doom if we're facing a stall, mill, or burn deck that's relying on their flip monsters a lot. These can be very good as, we can bide our time, draw more cards into hand that we can discard off Tribute to the Doom, and potentially get rid of things like Cyberjar or Magician of Faith, which can just be devastating if our opponent actually resolves them on us. So this is my take on the generic good stuff deck. You should probably have an extra deck here, just, to bluff that you might be on Fusion, but Fusion's pretty terrible in this format, so I can forgive you for not doing it. And I think that there's a lot of different ways that you can go with this deck. I've seen other builds besides mine that make some very different choices here, which I think are equally valid. And I think that over time, this build of the deck might be less good because different things will get optimized and different cards will get swapped out. But this has served me decently well in the games that I've played in this format so far. It is, however, very boring. Just, the game plan is just play good cards and overwhelm your opponent that way. There are a bit more spicy strategies in this format as well, so let's cover one of those. Now, I've labeled this deck as Maha because this deck originally started out as a Maha Velo deck, but in testing out that deck, I found that Maha Velo generally wasn't worth it, and so I just switched it up to a just more playing big equip spells and big beaters to take advantage of that. I think that with further testing, this deck could get a lot better, and I know of people in this format who are already innovating on this sort of deck and doing much better than I ever could, but this is sort of my initial build of it, and I've played a couple games with it, and I've liked it decently well. So let's just go through the card by card here. We've got a Cannon Soldier to inflict more burn, the 2 Jiraigumo as your big beater of choice, which pairs very well with the Megamorphs and the Axe of Despair to get in a ton of damage. And you could additionally play like a Dark Elf instead to sort of have more fine life point manipulation with the Megamorphs. But I feel like since we're also playing 3 Solemns in this deck, which also halves our life points to get into Megamorph range, I feel like I value Jiraigumo more as we may get into positions where we won't be able to attack or won't want to attack with Dark Elf given how low our life points are. 3 Magician of Faith to get back any of our powerful spells and also to potentially take advantage of a Painful Choice setup, although Painful Choice is a card I'm a bit iffy on in this deck. We've got 3 Mystic Tomatoes to fetch out our Sangans, Witches, and Cannon Soldiers, very, very good. So 2 Sangan, 2 Witch can search both our beaters in the case of Witch and also anything else with Sangan, so Cannon Soldier, Mystic Tomato, Magician of Faith, all those good cards. But that's basically the whole monster lineup here, just trying to get as aggressive as possible. We've got 3 Axe of Despair and Megamorph to sort of aid in that endeavor. You can also potentially pitch 5 of these off of a Painful Choice in the beginning of the game to just get a guaranteed equip spell to hand. But this is kind of iffy, as then you won't have those cards in deck for later, which is part of the reason why I think Painful Choice is a bit of a questionable inclusion here. But I think Painful Choice is good in other ways, potentially setting up for a lethal push at the end of the game. It can be very powerful in that regard, and I actually have used it many times in that regard, which is why it's still in this deck. I think in future iterations of this deck, though, it could definitely be replaced with something like an Upstart Goblin, which can also help you out with the Megamorph targets, and also thin down your deck a little bit, just like Painful Choice ideally would as well. For the other spells, we of course are playing the Power 5 limited spells, Change of Heart, Dark Hole, Monster Reborn, Pot of Greed, and Raigeki. We're also playing 3 Snatch Steal because it's crazy, basically Change of Heart, and allows us to get even more aggressive here. We're playing 3 Mystical Space Typhoon as well, over Heavy Storm or True Nade in the main deck because we are playing a bunch of equip spells and we don't want to have to get rid of them with our Heavy Storms. I also think Mystical Space Typhoon has some better applications in this format than Heavy Storm does, as you can preemptively snipe an opponent's Wuboku, which can be very strong for this deck. And lastly, for the traps, we're playing 1 Mirror Force and 3 Solemn Judgments. We're not playing Wobokus in the main deck. I think we could definitely bring them in later. But this deck is generally trying to be on the aggressive as much as possible, so we don't really need to worry about defending against our opponent's aggressive plays too much, especially when we have a Solemn Judgment to stop things like our opponent's Raigekis or Dark Holes, or even a Cyberjar if they flip it up themselves. For the side deck, we've got the 3 Wobokus that I mentioned. We've got 3 Trunade, 2 Heavy Storm in case we are going up against a deck where we really value the spell and trap removal, 3 Man-Eater Bug to act as even more removal, 3 Fisher to act as even more removal, and 1 Tribute to the Doomed in case we're facing a Stall Mill or Stall Burn deck that really relies on their flip monsters a lot. So I think that this type of deck, this more aggro deck, is a very neat deck to experiment with more. I know that other people are already experimenting with it more, and with that experimentation, this deck may rise up to be one of the best decks in the format. As is, I think it's already very good. And, you know, I don't quite have a tier list set up for this format just yet, but it could very well be tier 1. Very much unclear as of this point, as this format is still very much being explored. And there are some other very powerful decks in this format that go in a sort of opposite direction as this deck does. Speaking of decks that go in an opposite direction as the aggro deck, we've got our stall decks. And I'm going to start out by talking about Mill, as this is the deck that I'm arguably most passionate about in this format. This is the deck that I've tried the hardest to make work in this format, and it's the deck that's been most disappointing that it's not that good. I mean, it is good. It will win games, but it's not tier 0 or potentially even tier 1. It's a deck that you'll have to watch out for in this format, and a deck that you can definitely play and that can be very fun to play, but you know, my opinions on this deck have really soured the more I've played it. And so I'm just including it here as it is very interesting, and it does make use of 3 Cyberjar, which you won't be able to do in the next format. But realistically, this deck is not that good. So this Mill deck is basically attempting to use things like Cyberjar and card destruction to make your opponent draw a lot of cards and then discard them away with a card destruction and deck out that way. And this deck has a lot of different ways to do this. It's got the 3 Cyberjar, of course, and it's got 3 Spear Cretin to loop the Cyberjar back, but it also has 3 Magician of Faith, which can also be looped by Spear Cretin and enable you to get back card destruction, which can make huge turns where you basically card destruction your opponent for like 20 cards. It's insane. I've had some crazy turns with this deck when everything goes right, but that's the big issue, everything going right. Cyberjar is a very swingy card, and it can empower your opponent as much as it can empower you. And so that's why we're playing as many monsters as we are outside of these main 3, as you really do want to hit monsters off your own Cyberjars. We're playing 3 Man-Eater Bugs as well. This is a great hit off of Cyberjar. It can really stem the aggressive pressure from your opponent if they do get a bunch of monsters on board. We're also playing 2 Sengan and 2 Witch. These are very good at recruiting any particular flip monster that you'll need at any particular time. It can also be good at baiting removal, things like Raigeki and Dark Hole, that your opponent is trying to use to get rid of your flip monsters before they can activate their effects. For these spells, we've of course got the 2 card destruction, part of the heart and soul of this deck, insanely strong, and basically the win condition of this deck. We also have 3 of the Power 5 limited spells. We're not playing Change of Heart and Monster Reborn because those don't really benefit us that much, but we are playing Dark Hole, Pot of Greed, and Raigeki. Very good at clearing away your opponent's stuff and also drawing deeper into your deck for your combo pieces. We're playing 3 Giant Trunade, as this can be very good at boosting your opponent's hand size even more, getting even more card destruction plays off of it. So this is a very good card. It can also be used to recycle things like Sword of Forbidden Light. If you've gone through 2 turns on Sword of Forbidden Light, you can use Giant Trunade to add it back to hand and then play it again, which can be very good. We are also playing 3 Forceful Sentry, which can pair well with Giant Trunade, but it can also be used to make sure our opponent doesn't have the tools to actually disrupt our combos before we actually manage to pull them off. So I know some people have argued for taking this out of the deck. I think it's very important. It can also make sure that after our opponent draws a lot of cards off of something like a card destruction, we can make sure that they don't have any problematic cards still remaining in hand. So I think that this is a very valuable card in the deck, even if it's not as good as in other decks potentially. And the last spell I want to mention is Painful Choice, which can be used to get whatever combo piece you need, as well as setting up the graveyard for both Magician of Faith or Spear Cretin. This can be a very tricky card to play, as if you get rid of some pieces that you'll need later on, it can just lose you the duel. I know I've lost some games that way. But I think it still is worth including to this deck, as this deck really does need certain combo pieces in certain places, and this can enable you to set that up very easily. For the traps, we are maxed out on the good counter traps of this format: 3 Magic Jammer, 3 Solemn Judgment. We need to stop our opponent from disrupting our combo as much as possible, so these are all very good inclusions. And we are also on 3 Uboku, as we do want to have a defensive option if our opponent gets very aggressive. I'm not sold on this side deck, but it can sort of shift your playstyle a little bit. We've got 3 Mask of Darkness to recycle back our counter traps. Maybe if our opponent's on a more counter trap heavy strategy or a more Solemn Trap removal heavy strategy, this can be good to bring out. We are also on 3 Bistro Butcher to sort of get in damage and have our opponent draw more cards if they're on a weaker deck. This can enable us to make bigger card destructing pushes, although I'm not sure really how good it is. We are on 3 Prevent Rat, as it is a 2k defender, and it is the 2k defender with the least amount of attack, which is important given how many snatch steals are in this format. We are on 3 Gravekeeper Servant as well. It mills a card from your opponent's deck every time they attack, which can be decent. I don't think it's fast enough to bring it in most cases, but it can be good if your opponent has a deck that swarms the field with a lot of smaller monsters. And lastly, we have 3 Messenger apiece. If our opponent is playing a deck with a bunch of big beat sticks, this can be very good to bring in. You may notice that I'm actually not on Mirror Force in the main deck. I think you definitely could include Mirror Force in the main deck, but I figure that, our opponent's going to already be using like Heavy Storms and Mystical Space Typhoons on our back row enough, given that, we are a very back row heavy deck. So I decided not to include it. I think maybe you definitely could, and you could probably just add it as the 42nd card and not really change things that much. But this is the deck that I've been working with, and I haven't really found it that necessary. I've much preferred the Wobokus over the Mirror Forces. But definitely a change you can make in the future. I think there's a lot of changes you could potentially make to this deck in the future. I've done my experimenting with it and settled on this list, but there's definitely a lot of room for improvement here. And I'm sure that some people can figure out a build of this deck that works a lot better than what I've got here. But there's one last deck I want to cover in a similar vein to Stall Mill, and that is Stall Burn. Burn is a deck that I think is really, really neat and very, very different from previous formats here, and that's mainly because of the inclusion of Chain Energy. Chain Energy is just such a game-warping card in how you play around it, and it can be insane. So this Burn deck is basically maxing out on Chain Energy and playing 2 Toll in case it needs it. I found Toll kind of underwhelming, but it's still a decent card in many situations, so that's why we're still playing 2 of it. And for the monsters, we're basically trying to stall and burn for as much as possible. We're on 1 Cannon Soldier in the main. You could maybe up this to 2 or even 3, just to have more copies in deck when you need them. But I haven't been too torn up about just having the 1. We also have 3 Giant Germ and 3 Nimble Manga to both get more fodder on field for Cannon Soldier, but also to boost your life points and deal damage to your opponent respectively. The boosting your life points thing can be very important both in keeping yourself alive longer and also being able to play through Chain Energy just a little bit better, as Chain Energy is affecting both players, so you'll have to play a bit carefully around it as well. We've got the 3 Mystic Tomato to fetch out both Giant Germ and Cannon Soldier, as well as to fetch things like Sangan and Witch if we need to search out a given monster. And we also have Spear Cretin to both set up the Spear Cretin loop and also potentially bring back damage dealers like Giant Germ or Cannon Soldier. So I think the monster lineup's pretty good here. Spell lineup is, of course, where this deck shines. We've got the 3 Chain Energy to Toll that I mentioned earlier. We have all of the Power 5. This may seem a bit iffy, but I think that Change of Heart and Reborn both pair extremely well with Cannon Soldier, and thus are worth playing here. We've also got Dark Hole, Raigeki, Pot of Greed, of course, Dark Hole and Raigeki to clear away the board, and Pot of Greed to draw deeper into your deck to potentially get the chain energies that you want to see. We are also playing 3 Trunade. Trunade is great because you can set it the turn that you play Chain Energy and potentially get back those Chain Energies to hand when you want to make a big play later, and also set back your opponent a couple turns because you can get rid of their back row that they wanted to keep set and then make them pay for it again with Chain Energy. So Giant Trunade I think is very good in this deck, and it can also enable you to make more aggressive plays if you are trying to get in that last bit of damage through battle. For our hand rip cards, we're just playing the 3 Forceful Sentry. We don't really want to pay 1,000 life points given that we are on the 3 Chain Energy. So I think that Forceful Sentry is the best hand rip card to go with, and it can be very good at stopping our opponent from getting spell and trap removal that can really mess us up. So I do think the Forceful Sentry is a good inclusion in this deck. I could definitely see maybe switching it out for something else. Maybe some Magicians of Faith instead to get back your spells and traps after they've been gotten rid of with spell and trap removal. but I like Forceful Sentry here instead. So that's why we're playing it. For the traps, we are on 3 Just Desserts, which is a very, very good trap in this deck. It can just deal a bunch of damage out of nowhere. You can chain it to a Mystical Space Typhoon or a Heavy Storm activation. And so this is, in my opinion, a must include in the deck. And we also have 3 Magic Jammer to deal with that spell and trap negation. We don't really want to play Solemn in the main, as that can play really badly with Chain Energy. But we will be playing Magic Jammer, as it's just so powerful at stopping our opponent's big spell pushes. And also, if you do have Chain Energy up while you have a Magic Jammer set, then they will have to pay 500 for the card that just got negated with Magic Jammer. So very nice to see that way. And lastly, for the traps, we have 1 Mirror Force, as we would like our opponent's field to be somewhat empty at some times to potentially get in for damage and whittle them down even further. I think that maybe you could swap this in for some Wobokus potentially instead, but I like Mirror Force in this burn deck better than I like it in the mill deck. For the side deck here, we have 2 Cannon Soldier to get even more burning. We have 3 Mana Your Bug to act as even more removal. We have Okazi and 3 Tremendous Fire. I think these can be very good in these mill matchup, as it's just more damage to deal to them. And it also depletes cards from your hand, making their card destructions even worse. But it can also be just a nice surprise for any other matchup as well, as your opponent likely won't be expecting it. And lastly, we have 3 Solemn Judgment and 3 Woboku. These are just good general purpose traps to bring in depending on the matchup. Woboku is good against more aggressive decks, and Solemn Judgment can be good if your opponent's on a bit more of a counter trap strategy themselves. But that's going to do it for the main sort of decks that I wanted to talk about in this format. And I think the number of decks I've talked about actually shows one of the reasons why this format is so cool. You know, you go into it thinking that it's going to be some sort of degenerate format where everyone just plays the hand spells all the time, and it's just decided by who goes first. But it's actually very much not that. There's a lot of depth and complexity to this format that I never expected going into it. And I think a lot of people have enjoyed it a lot more than I expected to. I mean, I know I have. So I highly encourage just getting into the Discord, trying to play some games in it, because this format is a blast, and I'm looking forward to covering it. I probably won't cover it too much, as, you know, there aren't too many jank strategies that can actually be viable here, but I probably will show off some games with each of the deck lists that I've talked about in this video. But with that being said, that's going to end the guide. I know it was a very long video, so kudos to y'all who stuck through it to the end, but I hope that it was very helpful for anyone considering to play this format. If you have any questions about the format or any differing opinions to me on cards that I covered or decks that I covered, then please let me know down in the comments below. I'm always happy to discuss this sort of thing. But until next time, I've been Ben from YGO from Zero, and I'm signing off.